What really happened to Galileo Galilei? Without a doubt, this scientist is one of the most famous in history and one of the brightest and most admired minds from his time. However, it is more relevant to ask the question, is he more popular for his quarrels with the church or for being a great scientist? Galileo is not just a symbol of science, but also of the religious persecution that was supposedly carried out by the Catholic Church against science. However, very few know what this persecution consisted of. Even though Galileo is considered to be the father of modern science, he is particularly remembered for defending the position that the Earth revolves around the Sun, a proposal that was not originally his, but the Greek philosopher's Aristarchus of Samos. Copernicus based his theory on these proposals as well. Galileo's real contributions are not strongly remembered in popular imagination, perhaps because none of them blistered the church. The fictitious account by enlightened storytelling portrays a terrible Catholic Church who, contrary to the Protestants, stayed anchored in an obscurantist past and an anti-scientific persecution, something that does not explain why Galileo was a phenomenal Catholic. In addition, it omits the fact that Protestants in general also did not accept the heliocentric proposal at the time, and they would have punished him more severely if the shoe was on the other foot. It must also be kept in mind that Nicholas Copernicus himself was a clergyman. That means the first person in the history of Christendom to promote that the earth revolves around the sun was a member of the Catholic Church. Galileo put forward his views in favor of heliocentrism in the beginning of the 17th century, and then an anonymous denunciation was received from the Inquisition, which opened a process in 1615. Because of this process, there came about a negative repercussion. 3 books regarding heliocentrism were prohibited or suspended. Among them was the book that Copernicus had published more than 60 years before, and now had to be corrected in order for the heliocentric theory to appear useful only for calculations and as a hypothesis, not as a true statement. This is indicative that heliocentrism coexisted with the Catholic world without ever having been declared a heresy, and other than being a mere lukewarm censorship, no life was taken over it, nor was there any torture carried out against anyone. Furthermore, a great number of clergies, especially Jesuits, used heliocentrism in their work, and they firmly believed in it. Galileo was not informed of this inquisitorial process, but 1 year later, Pope Paul V reprimanded him to cease pushing the subject. Galileo, unlike his colleagues, who believed the same as him, continued to make noise regarding the topic, attracting a lot of attention, and acting as a theologian, which angered specialists in the field. Nevertheless, Galileo was revered by society at the time, and admired by members of the church, his main rivals being Aristotelian-leaning professors. Galileo participated in debates on heliocentrism even with Pope Urban VIII, who admired him, so much so that they would exchange letters and they met on 6 different occasions at the Vatican. He even wrote him a poem in Latin titled Pernicious Admiration. This new pope's disposition emboldened Galileo to return to his old ways and write a piece in favor of heliocentrism by adding a new argument that the behavior of the tides would only be possible with heliocentrism, something which turned out to be false. Galileo was willing to do a lot to get his arguments on heliocentrism more exposure, and he argued the most controversial details with the Pope. When Galileo wrote his piece, he presented it before the teacher of the Sacred Palace in order to obtain approval before publishing it. This censor also turned out to be an admirer of Galileo. He told him that with some modifications it could be published. However, Galileo was unlucky because more tolerant times were diminishing within the context of the 30 Years' War. Pope Urban VIII was being challenged by the Spanish ambassador Gaspar Borgia, who accused him of not defending vehemently the Catholic faith. In order to avoid more instability than already existed, the Pope took initiative with an iron fist, and it impacted Galileo. 2 months after Galileo's work reached Rome, the Pope sent the matter to the Holy Office. Galileo always believed that his rivals had poisoned the Pope's mind by telling him that in his book he was making fun of the Pope's stance against heliocentrism. This is why he wrote to him explaining that this interpretation was not his intention. The problem is that Galileo's work consisted of a dialogue between characters in which the good guy of the story was one that defended heliocentrism, and the other character that defended the Pope's favorite arguments was put to shame. This was interpreted by many as mockery. This was one of the reasons why months later Galileo was summoned before the Holy Office. Galileo was then reprimanded for defending heliocentrism, and 3 theologians concluded that his stance was indeed in its defense. Galileo denied it, and in doing so was seen as resisting to confess what was self-evident. Nevertheless, the Pope sent his nephew, Cardinal Barberini, who was also a friend of Galileo, to try to convince him to admit the charges, and in doing so, he would allege that it was not done in bad faith. This way, if he were to be sentenced, his sentence would be reduced to house arrest. In this way, the Pope could show strength during war-stricken times without harming Galileo, who he admired. Galileo himself knew that the threats of torture against him were false. It was never going to be carried out. Warnings were produced because it was part of the protocol to make him confess. The Roman Inquisition never tortured older people advanced in age, and Galileo was already 69 years old. Galileo falsely confessed that his vanity led him to do what he did, and that he had no intention of violating the formal warning that called on him to not talk about heliocentrism. Those of the trial claimed that Galileo had promised in the past not to push heliocentrism, but he denied the existence of such a commitment, and there existed no evidence other than the formal warning. When the judgment was rendered, he had to take back what he initially said in a humiliating way. Notably here, he never declared the mythical line, "Eper si mueve," a challenge which would have caused him many problems. At the end of the day, the Pope didn't even sign the sentence of the Holy Office, which did not give the document its final binding. The Cardinal Bellarmine, who condemned Giordano Bruno at the stake, stated the following: "I say, if there were real proof that the sun is the center of the universe, and that the sun does not go around the earth, but the earth around the sun, then we should have to proceed with great circumspection in explaining passages of Scripture which appear to teach the contrary. And we should rather have to say that we did not understand them than to declare an opinion to be false, which is proved to be true. I do not think there is any such proof, since none has been shown to me." The problem with Galileo's position was that he energetically promoted a theory that put into question the traditional biblical interpretation, while not having any way to empirically prove his propositions were true. He had good arguments, but no evidence. The ambassador of Tuscany, Francesco Niccolini, was one of Galileo's main supporters. Galileo spent the first days of his arrest in his palace. Then he marched off to Siena to stay in the palace of his friend, the archbishop, for a few months. Afterward, in his home on the outskirts of Florence. Over there he continued working, and his last work was published in Leyden, Holland, a place where sanctuary was provided for Protestants and Catholics who were persecuted, and later on enlightened people who were accused of atheism. Elvira Roca tells us in her work Imperiophobia and the Black Legend that a survey from the European Council showed that 30% of the students believed that Galileo had been burned at the stake by the Inquisition. 97% said he was tortured, and almost 100% responded that he uttered the phrase "Eper si mueve." The Enlightenment's mythology, superstition, and obscurantism drove the brilliant genius painter by the name of Francisco de Goya to portray Galileo being tortured. He was convinced that such an atrocity was actually committed, and this conviction has continued to be accepted by millions of people all over the world until this day. Ironically enough, there are even a few priests who have graduated from the seminary and still think that Galileo was burned at the stake. If the church has been such an enemy towards science as they say, it is because the Enlightenment legend had to resort to falsifying the Galileo case. Wouldn't there have been an overwhelming number of authentic cases to choose from? Well, no, there is not. It is clear that the demonized version of this story has underlying motives. It makes absolutely no sense at all that no one remembers what happened to the famous Spanish doctor Miguel Servet, who was burned at the stake by Protestants, nor what happened to the outstanding chemist Antoine Lavoisier, who was guillotined by the First French Republic for having been an official to the crown. The judicial president ruled that the revolution did not need neither scientists nor chemists. 27 intellectuals and scientists suffered similar fates, let alone the 25,000 witches burned in Protestant Germany. Another detail to note is that while the Catholic world has renounced the acts of persecution of the Inquisitions and has even restored Giordano Bruno's memory with a statue in Rome, the Protestant world remembers Miguel Servet with a lukewarm monument with an inscription that says, "It was a mistake by the great reformer Calvin." Calvin, along with Luther, had been honored with a multitude of statues, in several countries despite the persecutions and death they promoted. It would be the equivalent if Spain had erected numerous statues of Torquemada with an inscription saying, "Torquemada, our Grand Inquisitor, made a mistake with the false converts." Everyone should remember that Galileo passed the last 9 years of his life in palaces or in his home. Galileo's case has been manipulated to raise an eternal conflict between church or religion with science, even though Galileo never saw himself as a pioneer for this type of conflict. His problem was not with the Bible, but with the interpretations that were being held. Without a doubt, Galileo's reputation was the victim of an injustice by the church, who belatedly restituted it in the time of John Paul II, even though a mausoleum in his honor was erected in Florence during the 18th century. However, his controversial case does not cease to be used as a weapon by certain Protestant and enlightened thinkers. If we want more clear-cut examples of religious intolerance, we have more recent examples from the United States of America, with the trial of Professor Scopes in the 1920s, a Catholic teacher who had the audacity to teach the theory of evolution in the state of the Protestant-majority Kentucky. There existed a law which expressly prohibited the education of evolutionism because it called into question creationism. He was arrested, put on trial, and convicted. However, he was not given a jail sentence as was requested by the prosecutor, but he was to pay a fine of $100, which would be annulled only by a technicality. The law that forbade teaching evolution in Kentucky was not abolished until 1967. Until this day, there are scientific pseudo-organizations and museums that promote creationism and reject evolution in the U.S. There is still a minority, but considerable percentage of teachers who teach creationism as a feasible theory. This happens in private centers, since it is unconstitutional to teach this in public ones. Public education cannot promote a specific religion. According to this survey, 45% of Americans believe in creationism and that the earth was created 10,000 years ago. 56% of Protestants and up to 35% of Catholics. It's surprising that any U.S. Catholics would think so, given the Church's continued defense for the correlation of faith and reason. Even St. John Paul II encouraged the validity of the evolution theory in the 90s. This acknowledgement provoked a Mississippi newspaper to publish that the Pope was senile. Before, an enemy who wanted to ruin you could put an anonymous complaint to the Inquisition. Today, those enemies who want to censor you organize amongst themselves and report you to YouTube or some social network in order to close your channel or your account. We like to make ourselves feel better by believing that today science is above any dogma, but since Galileo's time, the only thing to have changed is the type of consequences. Nowadays, any scientist who dares offend the sacred scriptures of gender ideology or feminism may receive professional, personal, and even criminal repercussions. Presenting evidence that challenges the most holy political correctness, our scientific community is still vulnerable to being compromised by ideologies.